Jim is the author of the award-winning cocktail book, the PDT Cocktail Book, as well as his newer release, Meehan's Bartender Manual. In an article from Imbibe magazine, they described it as ambitious. And actually, in that same article, you went in and mentioned it was his midlife crisis project. But the word that comes to mind when I first began reading it was thorough. It really does cover the breadth of every aspect of the business when we're talking about recipes and techniques, the history of cocktail making, as well as service and hospitality. But more importantly, the thing about having a Chicago native here to talk about this, even though his career has taken him all over the country, is what we're known for in Chicago, being neighborly. We know our local watering holes, and we know a lot about our rich historic architecture. So with his newer project, Your Neighbor, Prairie School, we are talking about the influence that comes from Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie School aesthetic and the Japanese cultural influence that that has, as well as being neighbors to a great cocktail bar. So with that, welcome Jim Meehan.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Amy.
Congratulations on the book. Like I said, it's great. I read it.
Thank you so much.
I read it all.
This one has a lot of words in it compared to the last one, which is
of words.
basically it's
Still
like a
plenty of
children's book with
pictures.
recipes. Yeah.
Yeah, plenty of pictures, still great illustrations, and not only thorough, very thoughtful as well. How do you think that this book can translate to your readers that are not hospitality professionals?
I think that when I wrote this book, I sort of had Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance in the back of my mind. I started bartending in Madison, Wisconsin in 1995, and it was just something I've always loved parties, but I've realized later in my life that I'm an introvert, and I actually don't. I like the idea of parties more than I like partying, and I found that working in bars allowed me to be at the party, but not necessarily be like in the mosh pit there. And so I guess kind of after 20 plus years of this, bartending or making cocktails, serving people, I've kind of begun to start extrapolating how this is sort of a way of life. There's, you hear the maxim that everyone should work in, in a restaurant or work as a server or bartender at some point in their life. And as I have gotten older and started thinking about what I do, and when I started writing this book, I realized that I came into bartending through books. So in 1995, as all of you are aware at Google, the internet wasn't the capital I internet. We didn't learn how to do all the things that we know how to do through YouTube or through Googling it. And if you wanted to know something, you had to go to a library or find someone who could get you the book. So I learned about the history of bartending, the history of cocktails, even in some ways once I was able to find some of the older books about bartending through books. And one of the things I've found that kind of runs through all of the books is a lot of books they tell you the who, what, when, and where, and how, but a lot of books don't tell you why. And I would say for me, as I've gotten older and kind of been doing this longer and longer, I've found that as a young bartender, as a young manager, I always thought that the way to get everyone to get on the same page with me was to lead by example. And I came to a certain point in my career where I realized that by setting a very high example, by striving towards perfection, it actually was incredibly discouraging to a lot of the people who work with me. And in some ways, the way in which I carried myself, what didn't motivate them to want to work with me, it made them sort of shirk away from wanting to work with me. And I found in writing this book, and then eventually transitioning in management style, that if I actually showed people why I did things the way that I did them, they could think about them and come to their own sense of why they think that is a good way, or more importantly, we can open a dialogue up about what the best way would be to all do it together. And so when I wrote this book, I was thinking about not just the who, what, when, where, and how, but the why. And I think that in the same ways within your life and your business and my life and my business, I feel like that process of understanding that there are many paths to a destination is something that is important to understand. There are many ways to do things, and what I said right from the very beginning in this book is there are many ways to do this job, and here's mine. And I think the more in which either bartenders or architects or chefs or software designers can talk about their process and how they get to where the process in which they use to get to their destination. But that actual process, once you've formed it and come to certain ideas or conclusions about it, can be very useful to many people.
Excellent. And so I mentioned, of course, the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright in opening Prairie School. How did that project come about? How did your partnership with Heisler Hospitality come around? And tell us more about the influence in the space and your cocktail program.
So I have a sort of, when you hear a lot of people, when I listen to a lot of successful people talk about their career, their life, this sort of idea of like manifest destiny usually like creeps into it, and you hear of a story of like the self-made person who always wanted to do X, and their whole life has been this series of just moving towards X. And I think for me in my career, I wish it was like that. I always wanted to be a doctor, but that didn't work. So my life has not been a story of manifest destiny. My life has been a story of kind of opportunism and sort of understanding like what I was good at and what I enjoyed doing, and trying to keep doing more of what I was good at and enjoyed doing. I didn't come, Oak Park and River Forest are wealthy places. My dad worked at Maywood Racetrack in the admission department. My mom was a school teacher at St. Giles, teaching art first and then third grade. And we didn't have a lot of family money. So most of what I've done in life came from amazing opportunities being foisted upon me. Like, do you want to edit Food and Wine Magazine's cocktail book? Yes. Are you qualified? Just fake it till you make it. Like, yes,
Exactly.
I'm qualified. I've been saying I've been qualified to do things since, I was very young. And so I guess the exciting part about Prairie School, like PDT, for instance, people think that I just opened my bar in New York on my own, whereas I was actually brought into PDT as a consulting opportunity through the one of the regulars I had at the first restaurant I worked in. And they were two guys. One owned the hot dog stand, and the other was like his kind of childhood best friend. And they had kind of designed this, they had designed this kind of crazy kind of bar, and they just didn't know how to serve cocktails. So they brought me in to show them how to serve cocktails, and then we kind of have been involved ever since. So
the phone booth was the chicken, the cocktails were
the phone
egg,
booth, the taxidermy, all the sort of fun parts are Brian Shabaro, my partner, and all of the parts that I'm passionate about, the service, the drinks, the environment are me, which no one really cares about or copies. But with respect to Prairie School, it was an amazingly serendipitous. I was at my favorite bar, probably in the world, Bar Radio in Tokyo, and it's this tiny little, beautiful, like perfect tiny space, and enjoying cocktails at the bar, and there was there's never any Americans in there, and there was someone in there speaking English, and I didn't go there to talk to Americans, but towards the end of our visit, he said hello and sort of very humbly said that, he was a bar owner in Chicago, and we exchanged cards, and we met later again in Berlin, and then we would kind of talk, and eventually we did meet in Chicago, and his partner, Matt Eisler, they both opened Sportsman's together, and I always loved the Sportsman's Club. And I stayed in touch with them for a few years, and then finally Matt and I had a conversation about working together, and then last winter, I guess it was, Matt drove me down to this neighborhood when that was a construction site, and said, there's a potential opportunity to open something here. What do you think? And I was like, yes, I'd like to open a bar in the Google building across from the New Ace Hotel in the hottest neighborhood in Chicago. That sounds great. Okay. And the thing that's most, I think, exciting for me is that I grew up kitty corner to a Frank Lloyd Wright house in River Forest, and drove past the home and studio or the sort of temple every day to high school, and I feel like this project allows me to explore my roots. I left Chicago or the Chicagoland area. People who grew up in Chicago get very upset when you say you're from Chicago when you aren't from the 312 area. But I left this area when I was 18 years old and never came back. I attended bar every summer, and then I went to New York. And so it's amazing to come home and to be able to sort of learn about Chicago and how it came to be through this bar. So, and I feel like in opening bars, when you're able to put a little bit of yourself, a little bit of your history and your story in the bar that you have sort of operated, it's something that I think really draws people in and sort of resonates. I think with respect to the cocktails themselves, a cocktail, other than being delicious and intoxicating, ideally is something that tells a story. And I think a bar in and of itself should tell a story. So Prairie School kind of does that for me personally. It does for us as Chicagoans. It allows us to celebrate something that I think maybe flies under the radar, not necessarily for Chicagoans, but for people around the world. They don't understand that Chicago really is a design and architecture mecca globally.
And it does a really great job of walking the line, too, between inspiration and kitsch being too much of a theme. Y'all came to the right talk today because we have taster sizes for you of the Tall Boxes cocktail that they offer at Prairie School. You want to tell us more about Tall Boxes?
Well, first I'll point out the team over here. That's Moni and Christina, the real bartenders. There was talk of a cocktail demo, and I said, no, let's let the real bartenders handle it. So thank you guys. So I learned how to tend bar, as I said, in Madison, Wisconsin, and back in the late 20th century, the brandy old fashioned was was a thing. That was what people drank in Wisconsin. They still do, and it wasn't the modern, the old fashioned that sort of has become popular, the just bitter, sugar, booze, and a twist. That was actually something that we didn't make back then, but we made right back then would be called the old fashioned with the garbage in it. And the garbage meant that you muddled an orange and cherry and sugar with the bitters, and then you added the brandy, and then you probably shook it, and maybe you poured it. You did any number of things with it back then, any number of mixological atrocities. Yeah, a Brussels sprout, a mushroom, poured Sprite on top of it. But when I was looking at writing the original menu for this bar, I wanted to make sure that we were celebrating the Midwest and celebrating things legitimately. And so our house old fashioned, we call the Tall Boxes. It's this drink. It's bitters and one muddled cherry and one Kirsch brandied Morello cherry. We press that. We don't mash it into the garbage. And then we add Sacred Bond brandy, which is not like the Corbel we used to pour back in Wisconsin, which is probably mostly corn syrup. And we stir it, and then we fine strain it. So it actually looks like the sort of more elegant, old school, old fashioned, but it actually was made the Wisconsin style way. And then if you come downstairs and have it, and I highly encourage of all of you to come down to Prairie School and have it, the glass is obviously a sort of circular or cylindrical double old-fashioned glass. It comes with a big clear cube that is stenciled with our sort of Frank Lloyd Wright inspired. Actually, this is our logo at Prairie School, and it was taking the architectural details off the top of the building is what you'll see here, and stretching them out and kind of bringing them down to the base. And then we use Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of signature like red box, which he put in his blueprints as his sort of like sign off. So we stencil that into the ice, and then what you'll see with this garnish is the cherry is a sphere, and we've cut the orange into a triangle. So if you see it in the glass, it's a cube a sphere, a triangle, and a cylinder. And the idea is really sort of looking at how Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture sort of used a lot of those different elements. So it's a really simple drink. It's a drink that all Midwesterners who have ventured to Wisconsin are familiar with, but we've sort of refined it and made it more simple and elemental, which is something I think that Frank Lloyd Wright did.
All right. One of my favorite lines or quotes from your book is that you refer to bartenders as both craftspeople and salespeople. It's evident in how your career has evolved, but now that you've stepped out from behind the bar, you've already alluded a little bit to how you've progressed, but can you tell us more in particulars what opportunities just made you decide to take a sidestep toward consulting, and how do you choose the next project? Where do you find the inspiration or influence there? Well,
as I sort of mentioned, I wish that the manifest destiny element came in. I just chose my projects, but really, I don't choose the projects. The projects sort of choose me. And I feel like in some ways, my life has been a series of, I feel like it's like when one door closes, another door opens up. I feel like for me personally, a lot of the way opportunity comes my way is by making myself open to opportunity and by always considering opportunities. I would say that for those of you who have ever worked in bars or who know bartenders are probably one of the most opportunistic bunch of people you've probably ever.
I was ready for you to say masochistic.
No, I would say opportunistic. I mean, a bartender is always keenly interested in whatever sort of scheme you have in mind, something worth considering. So I would say that I wish I could call my shots, but that isn't necessarily how it works. But I will say that the projects that I'm always open to consider and the sort of thought process I go through, when I realized that I wasn't going to become a doctor because organic chemistry and calculus were going to prevent me from getting an A, a 5 and 7 credit A, I was like, just was like, it's not going to happen. And I looked through the syllabus and I picked up an honors French class, and I called a professor who was teaching a graduate level seminar on the Harlem Renaissance, and I was like, will you let me in your class? I've never taken any of these African American studies class, but this sounds really interesting. And she let me in. And it was the first class I took at Wisconsin that didn't have like 600 people in my class. It was like 30 people, or not, like maybe 20 people. And I remember raising my hand one day and asking who W.E.B. Du Bois was. And like everyone sort of like turned around and was like, but I ended up double majoring after taking 3 of Sandra Adele's classes in African American studies. So I always tell people, depending on the crowd and the television camera, that I majored in books and black people, which is why I became a bartender. But for me, my career has largely been based off of growing up listening to early rap music and seeing how this rap music turned into this hip hop culture and how certain artists within that culture were able to identify elements of rap music that could be extrapolated into fashion or into liquid or into design or into many different disciplines. And I feel like with cocktails, there is a culture to cocktails. There's a sort of sensibility that manifests itself. And I feel like so a lot of the projects I choose, whether it be like designing my own bar bag or working on a spice line with a friend who mostly works with chefs, or collaborating with American Express to do cocktails in airports where it's usually impossible to get a good cocktail. These are opportunities for me to bring cocktail culture or bring elements of our culture to a place where maybe people didn't realize they wanted it and they would want it. And it allows me to work with people who have skills that I don't have. Mm-hmm. I really enjoy meeting Googlers who know. I remember at the last Google Talk I did, Nick Anderer, who is the chef at Gramercy Tavern and now is the chef at Maialino, his brother is a brain surgeon, and introduced me to a Googler who, after his Google Talk, emailed me, and he actually went and used my app, and he created, you guys I'm sure know what this is called, but it was like a data map that was in 3 dimensions. And so there were like certain nodes where an ingredient was, and every drink that used that ingredient had all these lines in it. And it was like this crazy, like 3-dimensional map, so you could kind of see which ingredients you use the most, and it was like a cloud, and it was brilliant. So I feel like for me, the projects that I gravitate towards are the ones that take me out of my sort of like Dungeons and Dragons-esque sort of culture into ideally a more broad universe where I can speak to people of other disciplines who can, and figure out where there's sort of, where we can sort of find common ground.
Yeah, and more to learn, always.
Yeah.
Kind of a choose your own adventure.
But not choosing.
Finding the dark alley to go down next. With that being said, then, any red flags? Do you have like a standard set of red flags being like, definitely not going down that dark alley? That dark alley's a no.
I am a red
choose
flag.
this less dim one.
I have one of my colleagues who was employing me, so I guess he was my boss. He once called me his insultant, not his consultant. And I find that the red flags are really, in all of my projects, are like, do you have an affinity for being honest, being open, being transparent? I find that a lot of people you meet in the world, especially people who have a lot of power, unfortunately, really just want you to affirm what they think. They're looking for people to validate them. And
Yes.
I don't think about the title of the person that I'm talking to, or how rich they are, or what school they went to, or how much they can bench press before I tell them what I think. And the people who have a problem with that generally don't enjoy working with me. So I'm fortunately or unfortunately my own best red flag.
In terms of new projects, and once you've kind of found that new route, where do you generally find inspiration, like you find an opportunity, or do you have any traditions or methodologies to help you get past a creative roadblock?
I don't have creative roadblocks, which sounds
Lucky
really
you.
sort of like pretentious, but I feel like for me, like the way in which I work creatively is a lot of it is just based on history. And I would say that with respect to cocktails, I'm not a fashion designer, but I would imagine like creating cocktails or even cocktail programs is a lot like either creating a piece of clothing or creating a line of clothing. And a lot of it really is reflective of history. And I would say that for any of you who have been into cocktails or for any period of time, it's amazing how what's old becomes new, and what was just recently popular kind of goes out of style, even though it was like a good thing. And you'll find at times also that things are starting to creep back in that like shouldn't be creeping back in, but they are coming back because of the way the pendulum swings. And I find that for me personally, by studying history as a designer, as a sort of creative, I understand where things are going because I understand where they've been, and and I don't look at only cocktails. I look at like general zeitgeist and general, like, look at like creativity is something I would say that for me, especially having lived in New York, I would say that, and this would probably make some creative people unhappy, but it's like in some ways being creative or being innovative is really a matter, and this is which in Google, this must feel good, or this, because it is what probably you do and are. But in so many ways, being creative is about connecting the dots. And it's about taking data and putting it together and packaging it in such a way, and then really kind of racing to get it out first and to get it out in such a way that resonates with an audience. Going back to, I know you wanted to ask me about naming cocktails, but it's so interesting to preempt the question.
Tell us about naming cocktails.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that with naming cocktails, so much about creating, in some designers or creatives would say there's nothing new under the sun, it's like, but with cocktails, a lot of it really revolves around putting together the ingredients or putting together the different elements of a cocktail. That's like half of the battle. The other half of the battle is naming the drink and giving those sort of elements a name. I would say that the name of a cocktail is really in many ways its business plan or its marketing plan. And with respect to the first drink you had, the tall boxes, what do you call a brandy old-fashioned that you've sort of not really done that much to, except maybe Frank Lloyd Wrightify it? Well, you have to think of, all right, well, what is kind of going to be catchy? Like when I think of a cocktail name, I think about, is this something that people can pronounce in English, in Spanish, in Korean? Is it something that's easy to spell? Is there, a lot of times young bartenders will create a drink with tequila and come up with a Spanish name for it, and you're just like, come on. So with respect to the tall boxes, the origin of that name was that Frank Lloyd Wright, 100 years ago was describing skyscrapers as what he called tall boxes, and he was saying it with some scorn. And it's interesting, with that first drink, most people would think of the brandy old fashioned with the garbage in it with some scorn. So Frank Lloyd Wright actually ended up designing some skyscrapers. None of them really got built. But the idea was bringing in the concept of Prairie School and bringing Frank Lloyd Wright in a sort of tangential way to this drink that kind of ties in everything. And in many ways, to me, a great cocktail title ties in as many different elements as possible. And so that it signifies on a very elemental level, but that signification can go down low. One of the things I've realized as I speak about my trade is that information is like an iceberg. And it's like present too much information to people, like an iceberg, if we were all in our canoe as the polar ice caps melt and icebergs won't exist anymore. But imagine the polar ice caps still had icebergs in them and we were in a boat and you saw a giant iceberg. What you would do is you would probably sail around it so your ship didn't crash into the iceberg. Information is like that. Show too much ice, the person goes way around it. I don't want to know as much about it. Show too little ice, and then you crash your boat up right against it and you capsize. So I find that a drink like the tall boxes, you could just not really understand why it's called the tall boxes, order it, drink it, fine. But there's a lot more underneath it. And then the same thing kind of goes for this next drink. We have the King Kamehameha, which fortunately, our director of operations grew up in Hawaii, so he was able to correctly show me how to say Kamehameha. But this is just you could Google it, but you have to use the pronounce it app. But this is just a traditional punch. So this is a Taiwanese tea that's really sort of rich and sweet and kind of tobacco-y with a pot-stilled rum with lemon juice, maple syrup, and just nutmeg. And I chose to name it the King Kamehameha because I was sort of stretching here, but Frank Lloyd Wright's he designed structures all over the world, and one of his structures was recently rebuilt by Taliesin Architects in Hawaii. So obviously, a drink that has sort of like a rum punch would make sense to have a sort of Frank Lloyd Wright-y sort of tropical element. Not all of our drinks, by the way, are named after Frank Lloyd Wright.
Okay, let's talk more about how technology ties in. You discussed in your history section of the manual, but also, as you briefly said earlier, you spent a lot of time with cocktail books, and it wasn't always so easy to find these original editions and everything else. Now that we have the internet readily at our fingertips at all times, we have Google here, and as Googlers and as a verb that we use most often, how else has technology been integrated into the hospitality world, and how do you think we can be more careful and thoughtful in how we use it?
This is a great question, and what I was sort of like, this is tough. So if you look at modern cocktail history, one of my favorite books was Vintage Spirits and Forgotten Cocktails by Ted Hay. And Ted Hay was the original moderator on one of AOL's chat groups. And if you look at where this modern cocktail renaissance came back, the second edition of his book actually has an additional chapter that was 25 of the most influential cocktail bloggers of all times. And I remember when I bought this book as a guy who thinks he's an important modern bartender, I looked at the back of this book and I was like, why is this guy giving credit to 25 bloggers instead of actually giving credit to, because it was came out many years later, and to the bartenders who actually brought the drinks back. And many years later, as I've sat here and shrunk my head and became less of an egomaniac, I realized that if you read that chapter, you'll see how important, Drink Boy and all of the early cocktail, how basically this renaissance was incubated in internet chat rooms. And I don't have a cogent, long argument to make here, and I won't make it to you guys, but I would argue that the reason why the cocktail renaissance kind of came back had a lot to do with technology. and had a lot to do with technologists being really interested in cocktails. The two guys that I opened PDT with, Don Lee, who created our Benton's Old Fashioned, and John Darragon, who's a CTO of some, he goes like from one corp company to the next and gets like another buyout and just keeps getting richer and richer. But it's two tech guys, and I find that it's amazing whenever I meet programmers, they're always into cocktails and are always like know way more about it than I do. So I would say that the whole modern cocktail renaissance kind of came about with the sort of rise of the internet and sort of information technology. But in many ways, Prairie School is a response to something which I haven't liked over the last probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years, which is what I've found is that as so many bartenders learn how to bartend on YouTube from watching YouTube videos of their favorite bartenders in London or in Japan or in Singapore or in Barcelona, what I've found is there's been like a homogenization of cocktail styles. When I finally got the chance to travel in probably starting around 2003 or 4 to visit distilleries and other bars and bartenders all over the world, it was very cool to me how the sort of like throwing techniques, which you'll see at like progressive trying too hard bars nowadays, probably here in Chicago, that came from Morocco, and then really you would only see that in like Barcelona. And then the Japanese hard shake obviously came from Tokyo and was brought all over the world by a bartender from Bratislava named Stanislav Varda. But to make a long story short, now when you go to a bar in Indianapolis, you'll see the Japanese hard shake technique, you'll see the Boadas long throw, you'll see Australian sort of like chat, and you'll just see this like sort of monster hybrid homogenation of like this perfect cocktail competition winning bartender that to me has lost its Indianapolis-ness. And I find that when I go to a great bar in Indianapolis, it could be, it has the same bottles on the back bar, the same Japanese cocktail shakers as in Tokyo. It's like the same bar everywhere. The bars in Berlin are like the bars in Indianapolis, or like the bars in Auckland, or like the bars in Moscow. And I've found that in some ways it takes the joy of going to bars and finding the weird idiosyncratic tics that make certain people the way they are. I've found that culture is incubated and sort of preserved quite beautifully in its culinary and drinking traditions. And I find in some ways that YouTube mostly, but also the internet, has sort of made us more global, and I think that's certainly a great thing. But the challenge is, how do we figure out, and it's a question I would ask you guys, how do we figure out ways to better preserve our unique cultural sort of weirdness, like our brandy old fashioned, or our, I think Malort's terrible, but how do you make sure to know that like Malort is something that these weird Chicago people like drinking, even though it's not delicious?
Without homogenizing everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't want to drink Jeppson's Malort in Berlin, even though you like Chicago and Berlin.
Hey, Chicago, drink Malort.
Actually, I think Malort, well, whatever, I'll leave Malort alone for a minute.
All right, we want to prepare for some Q&A.
Yeah, we got 5 more minutes.
We got some questions here. I hope you all have some questions to ask for Jim. While we volunteers here, we'll bring the mic to you, Miss, and just wait till we have the mic in your hand.
So, question about naming the cocktails. How often do people ask you about the names, and are you kind of secretly hoping that they do?
I am secretly hoping that people ask lots of questions. Yes, so I mean, I wish people ask lots of questions, but it's part of what I would consider great bartending, going back to that iceberg theory of information, is really gathering a sense of why someone has come to your bar. And I mentioned this in the service chapter. You know, a huge part of bartending is just reading the data, looking at the situation. So for instance, you know, if you engage me, that's all. I think in some ways, just like us in life, we all want to be noticed. We all want to be interesting and desirable, and kind of want people to ask us all the things that we are passionate about. So yes, in my narcissistic little heart, I would love for you to ask me about how I came up with these little children of mine. But realistically, when you show up at the bar and with your suitcase or looking at your Tinder app or with your parents or there's a lot of reasons why people come to a bar. And I think a great bartender understands that you have to serve the guests based on why they're there. So yes, the answer to the question is I do want you to ask me about my drinks, but I have to be disciplined and I have to understand that you might be there for a date or for a business meeting or to catch up with your friends or just to get any old drink. And I have to give you that experience. And I think that with respect to bars, and especially with respect to cocktail bars, I would describe bars, and especially my bars, as what I would call elaborate traps. And what I mean by that is that so many times you'll go to a cocktail bar, and let's just say we go to cocktail bars usually because you hear about them. And if Mary Doyle, your amazing PR and marketing director, does such a great job, you're in the media all the time. So people come because they read about you somewhere. But in the event that you don't have a Mary Doyle or you're 10 or 11 years old like PDT, no one writes about you because you're 10 or 11 years old, your business is driven by word of mouth. And so most of the people who come to the bars that I am involved with are coming because someone brought them there. And the reality is that someone is probably a cocktail geek. But the 5 people that they bring, one of them might be a cocktail geek, but probably the other 3 or 4 of them are only there because they like their friend. And maybe they hate cocktail bars. And so a lot of times they'll go to a cocktail bar, they don't even want to go to this bar, and then they'll look at the menu, they'll not see anything on the menu that they want because they don't like cocktails in cocktail bars, and they'll order a glass of wine, and the bartender or the waiter will say, make them feel bad for ordering a glass of wine. And that will reinforce why they don't like cocktail bars, and then they'll just be miserable. And what I like to happen in my bars is you get dragged by your friend to my bar, and you order a glass of wine, and the server is not mean to you, and they have a somewhat thoughtful glass of wine to order. And then you get your glass of wine, and you realize everyone else around you is drinking cocktails. And you have 20 minutes to actually take in the scene, maybe try some of your colleagues' drinks. And by 20 minutes later, the chances that you are open to one of these cocktails becomes greater. And then maybe you order a cocktail the second time around, and then you're mine. So that's sort of the way in which I think bars should be run.
Hi. So this is kind of a personal question. So I'm from Cuba, and one of my favorite cocktail is a Daiquiri, a classic Daiquiri. And it's incredibly hard around the city to get a bartender to even know what I'm talking about. They'll always immediately go to the frozen Daiquiri party scene of New Orleans or something.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what your take is on that, on sort of these classic cocktails being either forgotten or kind of shifting to this super popular sugary frozen.
We got to find out where you're hanging out first.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, it's even nice bars, they will have a hard time sometimes making a good daiquiri.
The struggle is real. So the second drink you had, the King Kamehameha, is made with Bank 7 rum. I helped create that brand and have been working as an international brand ambassador of sorts for Banks since 2009. And this involved me making daiquiris all over the world. And I will say that the daiquiri is the hardest drink to make in the entire world. And it's funny, I agree with you. When I first started introducing the daiquiri to people, a lot of times you'd go to a bar and you'd ask for a daiquiri, and they'd say oh, I'm so sorry, we're out of strawberries, or I'm so sorry, the blender's broken, or we don't have a blender. And you'd be like, that's okay. Do you have rum? Yes. Do you have lime? Yes. Do you have sugar? Yes. I'm like, we can make a daiquiri. But the thing I've found is that there's nothing simple about this drink. The limes change pH all the time. A barista would be better sort of equipped mentally to make a daiquiri because they understand that the coffee bean, their main material, is an ever-changing agricultural product. The lime is as well. Their sweetness and sourness and liminess change at all times. The simple syrup that you use to make the daiquiri changes based on the aptitude and interest and focus of the person who makes the simple syrup for your bar. Or if you're so sad that you buy sugar syrup in, that sugar syrup is filled with stabilizers that makes it not so simple and actually quite flavorful in a really chemical way. And the other thing about the daiquiri is it is the elemental drink of strong rum, sweet sugar, sour. So you would think that that is something that's easy to balance, but what I've found in my career, which I guess could also probably relate to everyone's life, it was a very like matrix moment in my career. We were talking earlier about as a young bartender, you spend, who's like really serious, maybe you have like a mustache or some tattoos or shirt garters and arm garters or something, like you take yourself really seriously. As a young bartender that like takes your craft really seriously, you spend all of his time creating like the perfect recipes. And when the guest inevitably sends the drinks back, the first thing you think is like, what's wrong with you? And you like get bitter, as opposed to realizing that everyone has a different palate. And the like truly matrix moment for me was when the bullets came at me like much more slowly and everything started to make more sense, was I realized that if I stopped at creating drinks with this even notion that you could have a perfectly balanced drink, I would have a chance in pleasing more people. So I guess the long way of answering your question is that, are we about to blow? The long way of answering your question is the reason why you probably can't find a perfect daiquiri is because we all have a different conception of like it needs to be too strong, too sweet, too sour. And those variables, which you would think are easy, change every day. And I would say, to speak to your pain, is that we've gotten away from, and this is like me soapboxing, like saying, look what I'm doing and everyone else is not because I'm old. We've gotten away from elemental drinks, like the two drinks you had, a classic 5-ingredient punch or a classic old fashioned, and we want to make the Hemingway daiquiri before we ever make the daiquiri. And I think that these simple drinks like the daiquiri, which is a bike with a kickstand on it, a 3-ingredient drink or even a 2-ingredient drink like our highball are actually much more complicated, I would argue, to make really well than these 5-ingredient drinks with Malord.
I also went to school at Madison, and I was just curious what your favorite bar there is.
Oh my gosh. I worked at Paul's Club for 4.5 years, and it was my favorite bar until they moved it. The new bar does not feel as Paul's Clubby as it used to. If I had to pick a favorite bar in Madison right now, as I like think back, I mean, the bars I loved there were around the square. So I loved Jenna's, and I've always loved the Tornado Room. I think that the bar around the corner there is amazing. So I guess if I'm going to pick a favorite bar right now, it would be Jenna's.
Working in New York, you have a lot of great bartenders there. Brian Miller, Dale DeGroff, the late Sasha Petresky. Do you have any like main influences while you were working there?
Yeah, I when I moved to New York, I moved to Stanton and Clinton, and I was very fortunate to be there right when WD-50 opened. So Eben Freeman was the head bartender there, and Schiller's Liquor Bar actually opened over on Norfolk and Rivington just like maybe a year or two after that. So I was very fortunate when I moved there to be able to like have shift drinks with Eben at WD-50. Dewey Dufresne, Wiley's dad, was a really like amazing like wine and spirits collector, and I drank most of the 1900 Armagnac for free during those days. And Duchan Zarich and Jay Cosmas, who opened Employees Only, were the last bar that they worked at for Keith McNally was at Schiller's. So between those two bars, it was sort of like really influential for me. And then my first sort of like aha moment was when Eben took me late one night to Milk and Honey in 2003. I'll never forget sort of going there. Joseph Schwartz, who opened Little Branch with Sasha, was working on the floor, and Toby Maloney, who opened the Violet Hour here and ended up opening the Pegu Club as the head bartender with me, was behind the bar. And I had a Gold Rush cocktail, and it was a drink that TJ Siegel, who was Sasha's best friend, created, and it was a simple combination of bourbon and lemon juice and honey. Both Toby and Joseph were wearing sort of like the banker's garb, and Joseph had this beautiful silver tray with a candle on it, and he It was just very elegant and very accommodating in the way he served it. They served this drink to me in a ice cold old-fashioned glass with a hand-carved piece of ice. It was going back to the Daiquiri, it was a perfect sour with honey, Elijah Craig, and lemon juice and honey. And the environment was amazing. One of the things that has been sort of lost in translation as we think about the sort of modern cocktail renaissance is the milk and honey really back in those days was a refuge. Before apps were the way that people met each other in bars. And bars were really sort of, in my opinion, somewhat predatory, knuckle-dragging places where people kind of just like glommed onto each other and got wasted. And I didn't really like that. Like I liked milk and honey was like going to church. And so that was sort of a huge sort of like game-changing moment for me where I was considering focusing on wine and maybe being a sommelier when I grew up. And I realized that at that point, I'd been a bartender for 8 years, really loved it, and saw this kind of escape route into bartending. And so certainly Sasha and Joseph and Eben were early inspirations, and then obviously Audrey Saunders and Julie Reiner, and many others. I think that when you speak to a lot of sort of successful people or important people, they want to tell you that they were inspired or mentored by the most famous people that they know or ever worked with. And I would say for me, I've always made a point of trying to learn something from everybody I worked with. And I would say that every single person I've worked with has taught me something about my career, about myself that I didn't know. And I maintain that if you remain open to knowing more about yourself and more about your craft through being open, working with others, I feel like you continue to learn. I was sitting at Prairie School last time here. I've actually never attended bar at Prairie School yet, which to me is, when I have to attend bar, I know I failed. So
What are you doing a little later?
thankfully, you will not see me behind the bar tonight either, but I watched one of our bartenders, I believe it was Scott or Ed. He was holding both jiggers in one hand, which is something that came about while I was still behind the bar, but I never did that. But in order to do a 1.5 ounce pour, which is something that you usually either do in something I don't really like very much, you pour not all the way up to the top of the 2 ounce cup, or you have to do 3/4, it's a double pour. He flipped his jiggers in such a way so it was a 1 ounce cup and a 1/2 ounce cup, and he poured into both the 1/2 and 1 ounce cup and then dumped both cups into the mixing glass. And I like watched him do that, and I was like, I've been doing this since 1995, and I'd never thought of pouring a 1.5 ounce with 2 jigger cups in my hand and pouring at the same time. And I think it's so simple, but it's just something I've never seen done before. And I think that those moments for me are very exciting, and it's the reason why I surround myself with young, smart people and why I'm not so didactic about the way things are done. I think if you create enough leeway for people to do things their way as much as they possibly can, as the boss or as the overseer or operator, or really as the person who's responsible for everything that goes wrong, you put yourself in a position where you can like see people do things that you never would have thought of because you gave them the runway to take off from.
So outside of Prairie School, which is the best bar in Chicago, obviously, can you give us like a rundown of Chicago? Like, what are your spots, or where do you respect, or other cocktail bars, or even bars, how you said, like, have that nostalgic, like, authentic factor? So I think that's an interesting angle, is that obviously we have, like, the aviary right here, but there's also a lot of, like, good local spots, and it seems like you're well-traveled.
Yeah, I mean, I used to, when I was younger, I went to all the bars in Chicago, and that's why I don't go to all the bars in Chicago anymore. I sort of like all the miles in my liver have been used up. But today was a great example. I showed up early for a treatment and was sent around the corner to a bar called the Map Room. And it was like I was sent there to get a cup of coffee. And it's a beer bar from what Google tells me. And it was amazing. Like I walked into this beer bar and it didn't smell like a beer bar. And I sat down at the bar, and I looked at the spirits, and while all of the bottles in the back bar had pour spouts on it, which is a no-no in my mind, all the spirits on the back bar were really thoughtfully chosen great spirits. And the bartender pouring coffee was this incredibly effusively polite, probably Mexican gentleman who I ordered a coffee from. It was a black coffee. It was an Intelligentsia coffee. And I sat in the room, and it once again had that like church-like feel. And I would say that with respect to Chicago, certainly there are the milk rooms and the aviaries and the Billy Sundays and the Violet Hours and there are world-class bars that are doing next-level stuff that I would put up against the best bars in San Francisco or New York or London. But I find that the taverns that I visit, the sort of the corner bars in Chicago, are the ones that really kind of blow me away. And I would go back to not just the Midwestern sense of hospitality and work ethic, but just the idea that like drinking in Chicago is a thing. Like there's no guilt. There's no like sense of like, people have like a hedonistic, like Wisconsin's even better, but it's just like people eat and drink here with like, it's not like this thing that they shouldn't be doing or like this thing that they're doing instead of yoga today. Like it's this thing that they do as
After
that's
yoga.
like, well, it's or before yoga or instead of yoga. You know, it is their yoga. And I feel like the cross-pollinization of like great bars and operators, but great guests, like people who really enthusiastically enjoy bars, I feel like is what makes drinking in Chicago great. There's a symbiotic relationship between those who come to bars and those who work in bars. And I would say that in many ways, when I opened PDT, I like realized very quickly that my staff was fully capable of making what I thought were complicated drinks. What really became the challenge was in such a small bar, how can I do everything I can to make sure that most of my guests were sympathetic to what we were trying to do there? Because a couple of bad people in a bar, especially a small bar, just ruins the vibe. And in so many ways, I find that it's so much easier to run bars in Chicago is because most of the guests are nice, reasonable, like good, vibey people. Go to the map room. Have a cup of Black Intelligentsia coffee.
Let me preface this question with, I used to live in East Village in New York. Love PDT.
Thank you.
Didn't go there nearly as often as I'd like to because it was too hard to get in.
I apologize. That's what most people say on the internet too.
And got your book.
Thank you.
know, definitely appreciate all the thoughtfulness and hard work and production that went into it.
Thank you.
Also looking forward to the Aviary's cocktail book.
Yeah, their like
currently.
Kickstarter updates are
Yeah.
unbelievable.
So with that said, you mentioned Milk and Honey,
Yeah.
which has a, not, you usually don't get a drink that's on a menu. It's
There is
sort of
no
like,
menu.
Yeah, you want to, how do you feel today? Bartender's choice. So I wanted to hear your opinion on whether, which direction is the industry going, towards well thought out, well named cocktails or, creative, on the fly concoctions. And I guess, what is your opinion of which way should it go?
Well, I think that going back to my like matrixy sort of like Pacific Northwest answer, I think it's going in all directions. The cocktail culture is growing at this like sort of exponential pace right now, so it is definitely going in all directions. The reason why I haven't chosen to go in the choose your own adventure, how you feeling, brown and stirred, sort of forked path, let me find you a drink style of service that you used to get at Milk and Honey and you still get at some cocktail bars, is I feel like the writing a menu is actually really hard. And coming up with the menu and changing the menu, we have what we call a Secchi menu at Prairie School, where every 2.5 weeks, we actually change a page of our menu. We put 3 new drinks on, 2 new, a different black and green tea or oolong or white tea, and a different food dish and a different single origin coffee. So that changes every 2.5 weeks. And then our full menu changes, not in its entirety every quarterly, sort of in an American seasonal set. So I would say that for me, my interest has always been sort of pitched towards writing and towards design. And I find that the menu is a way for me to exercise my creativity in a way that I am passionate about and that I believe in. And I feel like it also allows, I think it's empowering to the guest. When your drink is going to depend really on the ability of the bartender to take you on the fork path that you want, if the bartender isn't great on taking you on that fork path, or the bartender doesn't want to take you down all the roads that are on that path, you as the guest may not really get to where you really wanted to go. So it puts a lot of pressure on the bar staff and on the person who trains the bar staff when you put it all in their hands. And going back to the question about, do you want me to ask about the drink? Not all guests want to have that much interaction with the bartender. So a menu allows, going back to my simplistic multi-purpose iceberg analogy, that menu allows you to deeply engage and see all of the path that we can, not all, but a lot of the path we can take you on, and the way that we're going to take you on your own terms, ideally if you speak English and read English. But it's going to let you see and become more empowered, I believe, whereas that sort of bartender-dependent, choose-your-own-adventure style is highly dependent on the sort of knowledge and demeanor and capabilities of the bartender and the willingness of the guests to want to engage in that way, which I just feel like not everyone does. So that's my answer. My answer would be, I have a way of doing things, and you could tell by my answer, I can tell you how I like it to go and why I like it that way. But I have so much respect for the omakase style cocktail experience done well. It is very hard to do well. I think we're out of time, right?
What time? One more? All right. Well, thank you, Jim, so much.
Thank you very
all
much.
for coming. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, guys.